we have a number of questions, and I would like to, we have 5 or 6 questions we would like to address and get different opinions on, so I will do that, and I will exercise my agenda control and the fact that I'm standing and our participants are sitting. So I will choose who to go with first. Tough question, but I think Floyd Kvamme is the person who has come the greatest distance. I know we could get a GPS out to look at that, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So I will give Floyd the first chance to answer, and then we'll go to Bob Inglis, and then we'll go to Speaker Hastert. First question we have, in your judgment, does the United States have sufficient natural energy resources to be self-sufficient or even a bit of an energy exporter of energy? That was a point that was raised somewhat in the third presidential debate. So, Floyd, have at it.
Well, to answer that question, you really have to take a look at what the energy, how you divide the area of energy. And I like to look at it in really 2 or 3 pieces. First of all, electricity generation. Secondarily, energy used for HVAC and industrial purposes. And lastly, transportation. If you look at electricity generation, the answer to the question is absolutely yes. We're totally energy independent. Right now, we have plenty of coal, we have plenty of natural gas, we have about 104 operating nuclear reactors, we have hydropower supplying a good chunk of energy, so lots of capability and a growing, albeit small at this point in time, renewables sector, so we are absolutely energy independent in the electricity generation sector. In the second area, I mentioned the HVAC for use for fueling industry. If you really look at it, industrial uses such as heating and heating furnaces for processing capability. Again, with the abundance of natural gas that exists in the country and the growing abundance of that based on recent discoveries, we are plenty sufficient there. Now, in that particular sector, we also use some oil. About 20% of our oil goes into industrial purposes. There's something like 300,000 different products that are made with oil. Of course, tars and asphalts and plastics being a leading, but lipstick has oil in it, in case you wanted to know, ladies. And like I say, some 300,000 different products. So that's where the squeeze comes. The third sector is transportation, and that's all about oil. And there we are not energy independent, but growingly so. Oil imports in this country peaked in 2005 at 12.5 million barrels a day. Today it runs 7.5 million barrels a day, a 40% drop-off. And that drop-off really comes from the fact that there was some really low hanging fruit, and that was called efficiency. The efficiency with which we used our energy until recently had not been a heavy subject. And therefore, we are not energy independent, although we get a lot of our energy from Canada. Canada is our #1 supplier for imports. About 25% of that 7.5 comes from there. Over half of it comes from the Western Hemisphere. Only 16% from the Persian Gulf these days. So we have a ways to go, but with increased domestic production, it is very conceivable to see us being energy independent as a North American continent in the relatively near future, and I don't know that we really need to be totally independent from a United States borders point of view.
I think I agree with everything that Floyd just said. That it looks like it may be possible in the transportation sector, and that would be comforting in terms of national security, to trade more closely or be more reliant on our good neighbors rather than some very unstable regions of the world. But the thing that I would add is that I wonder if it would really be a victory in that, if you think about it, I believe that OPEC's desire would be for us to find plenty of oil and to extract every drop of it, and to extend the life of their strategic commodity. Because as long as we aren't innovating away from petroleum, then they have some hope that their children and grandchildren will follow them into the royal palace and not be beheaded by masses that say, off with your heads because you're no longer supplying us with money from oil. So actually, I think that if you're thinking strategically as, for example, Saudi Arabia, you really want America to drill every drop and burn it up. And then, years later, they'll be there with plenty more oil. And by the way, in the meantime, what you do is you turn your spigot down if you're Saudi Arabia, and you control the price to keep it where you want it, because still there'll be a dominant supplier on the world market. And so you just turn the spigot down, you reduce your supply, keep the price where you want, extend the life of your strategic commodity, and America doesn't play to its strength, which is to innovate away from this thing that is in limited supply.
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the reasons we founded the center here at Wheaton is to look at two disciplines that I found in government is always there. It's ubiquitous in anything you do in government. It's basically the issue of politics and the basic of economics. And so many times we found that in our university systems, we silo economics, we silo political science or public policy, and we really don't find the middle, and people don't cross those planes. But in this discussion tonight, you can't ignore the political aspects and you can't ignore the economic aspects. And I think you'll hear a little political plunder, and I think you'll hear some real economics. And we're very, very fortunate tonight to have Mr. Kvamme here bring at least some scientific perspective to what we're doing. But, you know, I look at this issue. I was out in North Dakota this summer and looked at the gas and oil operations that they have. Tremendous opportunity there. Incidentally, there's no lack of employment out there. And the natural gas they find in Colorado, the gas sands, and just the huge exploration and discovery of natural gas that we didn't think we ever had. Now, I remember a couple of years ago, I was speaker, and natural gas went up because we had a limited supply. We depended on foreign usage or foreign importation of natural gas, and we're looking at being able to import LNG by huge ships. And the cost of LNG went up to $14, $15, $16 per unit. And what happened during that period of time, farmers who use natural gas to dry their corn, you also make anhydrous ammonia to grow as a fertilizer for corn. Other types of fertilizers are made with natural gas. Plastics are made with natural gas. All these commodities basically went offshore. A lot of them went offshore to places where, you know, they were buying Russian natural gas at 95 cents a unit. And so what we saw is because we had a shortage of this commodity of natural gas, we saw our economy go down. We saw a lot of our jobs move offshore, not because somebody was building new construction or manufacturing plants offshore, but basically because, you know, that's where the energy source was. Now, I have a belief, and when I left Congress, I felt this very strongly, I still do, that what we do in our energy policy in the next 5 years will really drive the economy of this nation for the next 50 years. You know, there's great potential with transportation. Fleets, I predict, will go to liquefied natural gas. I know our railroads are looking seriously. It takes about $4 million to replace an engine, a natural gas, a diesel engine, a locomotive, but it only takes about $700,000 to convert an engine to natural gas. And, you know, all you have to do is put a tank car right behind the engine, and you can go clear across the country. So I see that happening, and, you know, it's not convenient to put in right now, with technology is not there, to pull your car up to a natural gas pump and put it in. But you can do it with fleets. If I remember going to Korea a year and a half ago, and from the last time I was in Seoul you could almost cut the air 10 years ago. Today, you can breathe the air. They can breathe the air because they're using natural gas in their fleets. And so you have a huge utilization of natural gas. One of the dangers that we see, again, is the manipulation of economics. And there are people who would like to manipulate the economics on natural gas. And they're basically saying, I know a couple of U.S. senators will say, well, look, we're going to put a ban on exports of liquid natural gas, LNG. They can do that. They can try to do it. They said, well, we need to keep all this. It's kind of like what Congressman Inglis was saying. We can keep all this natural resource for ourselves. Kind of like what he was saying about the folks over in the Middle East. I don't agree with him, but that's what he said. And what basically, if you would keep all the natural gas and not export it, you would basically artificially hold down the price of natural gas because you hold down the market. And when you hold down the price of natural gas, you make it uneconomic to go out and do the exploration and the discovery. So if you want to keep us hobbled for the next 2 or 3 decades, then limit what we can do in exportation of natural gas. Incidentally, if we do export natural gas, then we can start to change our whole rate of foreign surpluses and deficits that we have, and we can become a net exporter and not a net importer in this country.
Thank you. Let's move to question 2. Question 2 reads, the federal government subsidizes numerous energy sources. For those of us in the Midwest, ethanol is a prime example. Some critics call for ending of subsidies. Do you favor continued alternative energy subsidies, or do you favor other U.S. government subsidies? So, Floyd, why don't you start us off again?
Well, I was pretty involved in the ethanol thing a number of years ago, and I think it's a very interesting story. We had real air quality problems in the country, particularly during the winter, with gasoline-fueled engines. Back in the day when you got 9, 10 miles to the gallon. And it was discovered that if we had an oxygenate in the fuel, that the fuel would burn a whole lot more cleanly. And the government mandated that an oxygenate be placed in the fuel, and there were a couple of candidates, ethanol being one, and MTBE being another, and some other lesser-known units. And of course, once MTBE was ruled carcinogenic, it left the market, and so you had ethanol. And ethanol has been around, of course. I mean, some people used to drink it, right? For a long time. And so it came into being, and it performed a very, very wonderful service. The speaker was just talking about cutting the air in Seoul, Korea. I remember when you cut the air in Los Angeles. The smog was so bad, particularly during the winter days. So that happened, and it happened because ethanol has a octane rating of 115, and therefore it's very, very effective. So. But there wasn't enough being made, and so the government came in and said, well, look, we'll incentivize the blenders to blend ethanol into their fuels so that we can get this going, because at that time, ethanol was in the $4, $5, $6 a gallon area. Some of you may remember that. Well, in 2002, 2003, we said, well, wait a minute, we've got this real shortage of fuel. Why don't we turn ethanol not only as an oxygenate, which is fine for, but why don't we make it a fuel? Why don't we face the fact that it burns pretty nicely and make it a fuel? So there's this transition. So the incentives that were placed by government to get people to blend ethanol in, the 51 cents a gallon at one point, which dropped to 45, we won't go into those details, but it performed a very, very valuable service. And the thing that I think went on too long is the blenders, which were primarily the oil companies, got the 51 cents or then the 45 cents per gallon. The ethanol industry really didn't see any of that. And so that subsidy, if you want to talk about, probably lasted too long. I mean, that could have been eliminated a lot earlier because ethanol had shown to be very, very valuable. Look at today's newspaper. I actually looked it up. Ethanol is selling about 38 cents a gallon cheaper than gasoline, and it's varied up to $1, from 20 cents to $1 for forever. It seems like in the last 10 years or 8 years or something like that. So the subsidy was placed in for a reason. The reason changed, and the subsidy wasn't taken away effectively. But today, I would argue that ethanol is a great contributor. It contributes greatly to the fact that our fuel supply is lessened by the availability of that product in the fuel mix. It allows blenders to use lower octane gasolines and bring them up to the 87 required at the pump by mixing in this 115 octane material. And it has been a successful, in my view, a very successful program. Probably the least talked about reason it's been successful is it has caused entrepreneurs to get really interested in the fuels business. And I could tell you about companies that are now, via biofuels, producing other biofuels that are almost like gasoline in their carbon content or in their carbon mixes. In terms of the length of the carbon chain, far more fuel efficient, far more like gasoline. In fact, some of them actually have higher performance than gasoline itself. And those will come to market because that entrepreneurial thing happened or started to happen as a result of that being there. So that's, of course, only one subsidy we could talk about, but it's certainly one that gets a lot of talk about. And people forget that, what happened was a change from being an oxygenate to being a actual substitute fuel. And you could argue, and I would say the biggest misunderstanding, and the people at the Wall Street Journal have had direct conversation with them about this, as I'm sure most of you know, every protein in an ethanol, in a corn kernel ends up, after going through an ethanol plant, in a pig, a cow, or a chicken belly. I mean, the food use of the distillers grain that comes out of ethanol plants is a very valuable second product for those plants. And so the thing that it attacks the food supply, you just can't show that technically. You can't show that economically, to use the speaker's point of view. So government got it started. It could have stopped it earlier, and it still would have been an effective fuel to use. But that's one example of where there was a jump start, you might say, because of a necessity of clean air.
I think it's also true that government may have started things like petroleum use and focused on it. Here's what I'd say, that where we are now is that it would be a great idea, this is not very polite to come to the Midwest and say this, but to eliminate all subsidies for all fuels, and then to attach all cost to all fuels, seeking a true cost comparison within the marketplace and believing in markets and their ability to sort it out. And so when we're talking about eliminating all subsidies for all fuels, of course, if you're from the wind industry, you're gasping for air at this moment because you realize if we don't extend the production tax credit at the end of this year, there are no more wind turbines sold. And perhaps that needs to be scaled out over time or phased out over time and not cold turkey come the end of this year. But I would suggest that really if we believe in markets, if we believe in the power of liberty and people making decisions out of enlightened self-interest, then what we really want is a true cost comparison between fuels. We want all the cost in. We don't want any subsidies for any fuels, but we do want all cost attached to all fuels. That's something maybe we'll discuss later, but at this point, what's worth discussing is just eliminating all subsidies for all fuels. And by the way, I think that means all fuels, including the accelerated depreciation, for example, for oil and gas leasing and those sorts of things, including making sure that people pay market rates for recovery of resources off of public lands rather than sub-market rates, so that really you are trusting the marketplace to set a price and then consumers to act based on that price and to choose themselves without clumsy government mandates, without fickle tax incentives, how to meet their needs. And my contention, our contention in the Energy and Enterprise Initiative is that will cause innovation to happen very rapidly. Because then when you set the economics right and have a true cost comparison, we have people pursuing a profit motive and delivering to consumers products that work. Because the beautiful thing about a capitalistic system is that one makes money by serving the needs of your customer. And so you become a servant, you serve well, you get rewarded, and the system works. But it starts with a true cost comparison, and that's what I think is the first part of it, is eliminating all subsidies for all fuels. The second part we get into is attaching all cost to all fuels.
Well, I was interested in the question because the question talked about the tax subsidies on ethanol, and the question's just wrong. There is no tax subsidy on ethanol. It went away. And it was not to the farmers, it was to blenders. And when that was the oil companies. And the ironic thing is, when the tax subsidy went away to the oil companies who were getting paid to blend it into their fuel, all of a sudden, when that went away, then they were crying and yelling, oh, look at the food prices, look at all these things happening. And I would say that the petroleum companies today are creating this huge hue and cry out there. Interesting because the proteins and the food that goes through the ethanol process ends up in the feed bunks across this country. And interestingly enough, also that they said, well, it costs the food. Well, basically the field corn that's used for ethanol doesn't go to food. It's not a food product; it's an animal product. And so I think that's a misnomer in that question. I would want to take issue with that. The second part of it, but let's go back to the real issue, that, when ethanol first started to come on the scene, I was a member of Congress. And of course, my district, basically, it started here and it went all the way to the Mississippi River. I had a lot of corn and beans, a lot of farmers. And one of the things that most farmers wanted is get the government off their back. Not to subsidize this or subsidize that and tell them what they had to grow or limit this. They wanted to be able to be producers. And the best way to be producers is create a market for their commodities. So things like corn sweetener and corn starch and ethanol are great contributors to being to our production of our farmers. But they also want to be able to raise their corn and sell it for not $2 a bushel or $3 a bushel, which it was a couple of years ago, but an honest price of $5 or $6 a bushel, which really gives them a profit. Not a huge profit, but gives them a profit over their growing cost. So ethanol fit very nicely with that whole philosophy. Is let's use our potential to produce in this country. Instead of, if you had 15 billion gallons of ethanol used every year, that's 15 billion gallons of ethanol that we didn't have to import from someplace else. And when you're talking about importing from someplace else, you're talking about Saudi Arabia that the gentleman over here talked about. You talked about Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Venezuela, not necessarily the most friendly people and the people that really worked about our welfare. So the more that we can become energy independent, the better off we are. And ethanol is a very basic brick in that foundation. And we need to do everything. We need to, in my opinion, all the energy questions is, well, we need to do everything above ground. Well, we need to do everything above ground and below ground and in between, wherever we can find it. And if it has to come out of the laboratories of science, then we need to use that too. But we need to make this country energy independent. Now, if we can use the abundant resources that were left here for us to use, I always said that in an argument, the state of Illinois had more coal under this state of Illinois than Saudi Arabia has oil, if you really looked at just pure energy. But there are ways, if you allow it to happen and you do the research, that you can use coal, and it's clean coal. And it's also coal it's not rocket science, folks. The Germans used it in World War II. They took coal to gasoline or petrol, and they ran their whole war effort basically on that. So it's nothing new, but it needs our ingenuity. We need not fetter it with government regulation. We need to let it go and let us use our ingenuity and our productivity to make it happen.
Okay, let's move on to question 3. What is your assessment of climate change, and what does your assessment mean for the government's role in energy policy? So go ahead, Floyd.
Well, that's the simple one for the night. If you believe that, I got this bridge I'd like to talk to you about. Here's where I come out on this, and I've spent a lot of years on this, obviously while I was in the administration, but also subsequent to that. The considered opinion of many is that they can identify and show a relationship between our climate and a single element, carbon dioxide. To me, that is scientifically very, very flimsy grounds to show that correlation, because you just look at most things in nature. They have multiple ingredients affecting how they operate. Now, having said that, carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas. There's no question about that. So what should we worry about? That's the question I've tried to look at. And, we've had people on both sides claiming, the horror of too much carbon dioxide or the fact that there's no problem. What do the hard data show us? One of the areas that's looked at is ocean rise. And the fact is that the ocean has been measured for its average height for about 140 years, since 1870. A ship called the Challenger did studies at that time. And the ocean has risen 9 inches in those 140 years. The rate of change of that rise isn't very much. It's pretty linear. And that's it. And it continues to rise at about that level. People say it's based on the ending of the Little Ice Age, which was in existence, of course, when Washington crossed the Delaware, and that we were coming out of that. What else can we look at? Well, obviously, there's a lot of effort tried to measure the atmospheric temperatures. And if you follow this closely, you know that there's a group in England that publishes some very fundamental reports there. Their number for temperature rise shows that in that same 140, since I guess it's about 100 years, the temperature has risen 0.8 of a degree centigrade, Celsius. And that's true. The rate of rises, then it flattens, and we've just come out of a slight plateau in that rise in the last 15 years or so. It was a little bit more aggressive rise the 15 years before that. But the data they're very difficult to measure. And so to say that we're going to have what some predict in 2100 based on this, I don't see the scientific evidence for that. And I have spent a lot of time trying to find that scientific evidence. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over is that the magic year is 1990. Everyone wants to return to what we were at 1990. We were at about 360 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. In the 1800s, we were about 280. Now we're about 393, somewhere about that ballpark. You had people talking about a 450 cliff the world would end on 450 parts per million. If we could control carbon dioxide, I think an interesting scientific question is, what would be the right level? Maybe it's more than where we are now. Maybe it's less. We know that plant growth is better in a high carbon dioxide environment. We obviously given water and nitrogen levels, but the tests are irrefutable on that subject. We know that there are variations that are going to happen, but to me, nailing 1990 as somewhat of a magic year, I don't see any scientific basis for that. There's more basis for a lot of other numbers, particularly if you look at all the kinds of parameters. So yes, the Earth's atmosphere is rising in temperature. It's risen, like I say, 0.8 degrees. The oddity, when I was in the administration, I got to know the guy who had to give the report every quarter, and a very nice guy. I can't remember his name right now, but he used to hate the day he had to release the report. He says, because I can't win. This half will say I'm wrong this side, this half will say I'm wrong that side. Nobody will be happy with any report I ever give. It's kind of frustrating. I said, well, what do you think's going on? And he said something very interesting, because this has been corroborated in the recent years. He says, it seems like the Arctic is getting warmer and the Antarctic is getting cooler, and I don't know why. But that's kind of interesting, that those two things are happening. So going back to a point the speaker made earlier, when I look at what Europe did in energy credits, in carbon credits, and all those kinds of things, I think it's been a blinking disaster to their economy and everything else, and I think they've gained nothing. There's no change in the slope since Kyoto came into effect. There's virtually no change in the slope of ocean rise. There is a lessening, but the carbon keeps going up in the rise of the temperature. I personally don't believe they had anything to do with it. So I think you got to be very, very careful how dramatic you get on solving a problem that you don't understand. I like solving problems I understand.
Go ahead, Bob.
I think a number of the factoids you just heard are minority factoids.
I don't think so.
They're actually supported by a minority of climate scientists. So the question before us, if you're a policymaker, for example, you're Governor Christie in New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy is coming your way, says the National Hurricane Center. If you're not a meteorologist, and Governor Christie is not, I think you rely on the meteorologist at the National Hurricane Center. And you say, there's a hurricane coming, get out of Atlantic City. Now, what's really interesting to me is that on climate change, it's really the same science. It's just spread out over a longer period of time. People trying to model climate just like we model hurricane paths. Now, I grew up at the coast, and I can tell you, when you got a hurricane coming, you listen very carefully to those models. And if you're not a scientist, you don't dispute them. You hope that there's some scientists out there that are perfecting the models, and we've gotten better and better at predicting landfall and storm surge and all those kind of things. All the models can be, on climate change, can be picked apart at this point or that point. But for goodness sakes, these people are trying their best to model an incredibly complicated system. So what I would submit to you is it would be irrational for Governor Christie to doubt the National Hurricane Center and say, I think probably not. I think we're probably okay here in New Jersey. That perhaps you want to listen to them and hope that if they get a little bit wrong and it goes into New York City rather than wherever it landed, maybe next time they'll get a little bit closer. But in the meantime, we're evacuating everywhere from, say, Maryland to Maine, or whatever. We got to get people out of harm's way. So what I'd suggest to you, particularly here in the context of faith at Wheaton, is I think it's not a head issue. I think it's a heart issue. Why do our hearts want to reject that information? I think it has something to do with the heart, not the head. Unless you want to proceed pell-mell in the face of risk, which seems to me as a conservative is the opposite of conservatism, then you'd want to take account of the risk. So I'll offer you this deal. You're paying about $800 a year for homeowners insurance. The chances of your house burning in this next year are really quite small. So I'll give you $20 right now if you'll call your insurance agent before we leave here tonight and cancel your policy and agree with me that you will keep it canceled for the coming year. Anybody willing to take the deal? No, right? Because it's a very unpleasant thing if your house burns down. And so you insure against that risk. Now, there's some price that you won't pay for that insurance. If, for example, the price of that insurance rose to $50,000 to insure your $300,000 house, you probably wouldn't take it. And there is a point at which action on climate change would be so draconian to the economy that you wouldn't pay the premium. But I would suggest to you that if it comes in a little bit like a homeowner's premium, just as you insure your home, does it make sure to insure your planet? Probably so, right? Unless you really are quite liberal and quite willing to proceed in the face of great risk. Or maybe not it's great risk, just some risk. It's very small risk your house can burn down, really. I'll give you this opportunity, $20 for anybody that will cancel your insurance policy. Because it's not going to burn down this year. I can pretty much guarantee it. Pretty much. Pretty much. And even if you think it's pretty much guaranteed that climate change isn't real, well, you want to buy a little insurance policy? Are you 100% sure that the scientists are all wrong?
I hope I get a chance to rebut that.
We'll give you a chance.
Well, look at, you had a politician over here and a politician here and a scientist in the middle, so I'm not sure who we're arguing against, but I don't want to get in the apples and oranges like Bob is. I think we really talked about the real issue. I was at Kyoto when they put the Kyoto Accords in place about a decade or so ago. And I was interested in a lot of the arguments, and we were there, and we were accompanied by Mr. Waxman from California, who was very active in doing this, and then Vice President Gore. And I was wondering about all these countries that were very active. Of course, you know, the signatories was the whole world, basically, but the countries that really had to adapt were Japan, Germany, France, England, and the U.S. Everybody else were productive countries, India, China, Poland, Eastern European countries, most of Africa, all of Africa, were left off. They were developing nations. And I remember sitting down with the economic, and his title was both the economy and the environment in China. And I was talking to him about, you know, putting up 250 megawatt coal plants, literally one every week, with no SOx or NOx or CO2 controls on it. He said, don't worry about it. He said, you had 150 years to grow your economy. We have to do it very shortly, so we shouldn't be, you know, tied with these kind of constraints. I mean, that was the attitude where the biggest, one of the biggest polluters in the world are. And interestingly enough, you know, Bob was talking a little bit about Saudi Arabia, and I disagree with him vehemently. Saudi Arabia, I've been there about half a dozen times in the last couple of years, and Saudi Arabia, you know, isn't reserving their oil and waiting for us to turn the spigot. They're selling their oil to China, and they're selling it to India and other countries that all of a sudden become the great demanders. And at the same time, they're starting to develop their own. So they're using their oil to develop, instead of selling commodities, they want to sell finished products. So they're creating cement, and they're doing science whole cities of science, technology, and industrial cities, so that they can be a participant in the world market, not just an economy. So they're going down a different path that Bob said. But I think one of the interesting things is that, you know, the last 2 years I was in Congress, or last year I was in Congress, I was on the Energy Committee. And of course, climate change was a big issue. And I seriously wanted to listen to all the arguments and look at it. And I went to Germany. I went to Europe on a trip, a couple of members of Congress. And we first went to Copenhagen, and went to Copenhagen. In the middle of the street in Copenhagen, there's this big black kind of bag there. And I found that was a ton of CO2. I wasn't sure how big a ton of CO2. But it's probably, I know now, it's about as wide as this desk, maybe 3 times as high, and it's black. And so that's what a ton of CO2 is. And then we went to Germany, and we talked to the Germans and said, you know, we're basically going to shut down our nuclear plants because we don't want all this terrible nuclear energy. And by the way, we have this CO2 sequestration. So I said, I'd like to see it. So we took the half a dozen members of Congress and a couple of our staff and got on this small bus and went out to this huge old lignite coal plant that was about 25 miles, my direction here, 25 miles west of the Polish border in former Soviet-controlled East Germany. And it's a beautiful coal plant, just huge and big, tall silos and towers and coal burning facility, boilers, everything is fine. So we had this grand tour. Finally, we were up on the very top of this coal burning. It was one of the towers, and I said, you know, he said, well, there's Poland. You can see Poland. I said, well, that's interesting. I said, but we came here to see the CO2 sequestration that you're so actively doing. I said, where is it? So, well, you know, we broke ground, but we haven't built it yet. I said, okay, well, that's interesting. I can understand that. What are you going to do with the CO2? I said, are you inject it under this lignite? Because that's a big question. You start injecting CO2, where does it come out? But you can inject it under the lignite. No, we're going to put it in trucks. Oh, really? What are you going to do with the trucks? We'll take the trucks to Poland. And they could just let it go. And that was Germany's plan. In the meantime, the electricity costs of consumers in Germany went up 30% because it had this scheme of trading credits on CO2. Who lost? Who won? I tell you, the German people lost. Finally, they said, this is kind of ridiculous, and they have abandoned it, basically. Oh, incidentally, they're going to shut down their nuclear plants, and again, the raising costs to the German people, and at the same time, they're going to import energy from France, made from nuclear energy. So, I mean, it doesn't really pan out when you look at the balance sheet on these things. And again, it's interesting, you go back and you talk about the Kyoto Accords. Japan went through this terrible tsunami. And through most of the reports and looking at it, there were some flaws, probably wasn't managed the way it should, and this Fukushima plant, leaked. 4 generating stations, 4 nuclear units, and all of them are basically upside down and letting out nuclear. And so you have about 50 square miles, when you put kilometers into miles, of land that probably will never be used again in Japan. So Japan has basically, but when we did the Kyoto Accords, Japan said, well, we're not going to use fuel oil anymore. We're not going to use coal. We're not going to use LNG much, but we're going to go and use totally nuclear. So all of a sudden, their nuclear capacity is shut down. 30% of their energy, or 30 to 35% of their energy source is shut down. But they've foreclosed themselves from doing oil and coal. Now they're trying to buy LNG from Australia and Canada, our neighbor, but they can't buy it from us because we're not exporting. And so what happens is the Japanese today, almost everything in Japan runs on electricity. Their trains run by electricity. Their factories run on electricity. Their urban systems run on electricity. Their air conditioning runs on electricity, obviously. So the country basically runs on electricity. So they're down on capacity 35% of what their need is today. And so basically there's brownouts in Tokyo. People don't have air conditioning in the summer. I guess we can live without that. Most people can just shut the switch off if they want to save that. Don't have to have a catastrophe to do that. What happens is that their factories are down by 40%. Matter of fact, you're not manufacturing anything in Japan today. They're making some parts, and they're sending parts to Korea, and they're sending parts to China, and they're sending parts to Vietnam so that they can actually get things manufactured, but they can't do it in Japan. Why? Because they've artificially tied themselves down with an artificial limitation of what they can do with their energy capacity, and they're hobbled. They're a country that ever since the Kyoto Accords, if you look at the economic map, and I'm not sure it's totally cause and effect, but they're upside down. And if we want to hobble our economy, folks, if we hobble what we can do as a country and be productive, all we have to do is put these kinds of constraints on ourselves.
Okay, I will give Floyd 120 seconds, and I'll give Bob 60 seconds to respond to a rebuttal and a rebuttal's rebuttal.
Now, the thing that I don't agree with what the representative said is that there's like these two poles of opinion on this. There's a wide spectrum of things on climate change, and scientists are spread throughout that spectrum. I know that you know what carbon dioxide does in the atmosphere, but if you go to what has been prognosticated by some, I look at it as shouting fire in a theater. You're creating a problem that is not anywhere near that. Why have all of the models failed to predict what's going on? You know, the 2010 was the first date. The models were way off. So it's nothing like the hurricane forecast model. The models today say, you know, about 0.08 degrees per decade, plus minus 0.15. So the model gets you from negative to positive. You know, it's nowhere near what that is, and it's nothing like an insurance policy we're talking about doing. We're talking about doing to our economy something that is probably not necessary for a goal that we can't even nail down. I just object to the notion that that carbon dioxide is poison. We need it. In the way our system works, we need carbon dioxide to grow plants. I mean, et cetera. That's how the world works. So I object to the in my view, irrational aspects that have been perpetrated heavily into our young people. The data aren't there to support. How many people here know that the ocean went down in 2010? Nobody does, because nobody talks about that. But the ocean level went down in 2010. Nobody knows why, but it did. Yes, there's this constant rise, but it does strange things.
Bob?
There is a range in the models. That's very true. Here in the land of Lincoln is where we got the National Academy of Sciences. President Lincoln said policymakers need a scientific body to offer advice. He created the National Academy of Sciences. They have studied all this. I'm not a climate scientist. I don't think Floyd is, and I don't think the speaker is. They have studied this. They came to a pretty clear conclusion. Isn't it unusual that members of Congress don't respond to that conclusion? We typically respond when the National Academy of Sciences tells us something, just as Governor Christie responded when the meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center said, Sandy is coming your way. So, but the thing that both the speaker and Floyd raised is this concept of hobbling our economy. So I hope we have time to get into the solution that we're proposing at the Energy Enterprise Initiative, which is not cap and trade. I voted against cap and trade. I think it's hopelessly complicated. I think the free allocations are embarrassing and destructive of the entire purpose of the bill. I think that it is a massive tax increase, grows government and decimates American manufacturing. For all those reasons, it should have been a non-starter, just as the speaker mentioned Kyoto should be. But how about this? What conservative wouldn't jump at the chance to reduce taxes on income and to shift the tax onto CO2? As Art Laffer, Ronald Reagan's economics advisor, says, he doesn't know whether climate change is real or not. He says he doesn't need to know. All he needs to know is you're taxing something you want more of, and you're not taxing something you maybe want less of. He says it's a no-brainer. Change what you tax. It's called a Pigovian tax swap. And all of you taking economics know that there's a Pigovian club. It includes people like Greg Mankiw, who advises Governor Romney, Glenn Hubbard, who is chairman of the economics advisors as well in previous administration. People like that saying, change what you tax. And so even if, I would stipulate this, even if climate change were hooey, even if it really isn't of concern at all, why not do the tax swap? Because then you would free up from taxation income and you'd tax a stand-in for the problem of climate change. But even if you think climate change isn't a problem, as Art Laffer would say, well, okay, then we'll tax anything besides income. And so why not do a tax swap? And even if you think climate change is all wrong. So I hope we get into that, because I think it could be discussed even if you didn't think climate change is real.
I think you already give your part on it. I think you already discussed it.
Okay, let's move on. We want to give Amy and Winnie a little bit of time. We have 3 more questions. I would like to have a bullet sentence from Speaker Hastert on question 4, a bullet sentence answer on question 5 by Floyd Kvamme, and a bullet sentence response on question 6. So question 4 is about merging the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, Interior Department, whether that's worth it. So Speaker, if you could address that.
I say it again.
Some analysts claim that the U.S. energy policy is fragmented between the U.S. Department of Energy, the Interior Department, the Environmental Protection Agency. A common claim is that fragmentation leads to redundancies and lack of coordination. Do you think the U.S. government should streamline these entities with some sort of combination? So that's reorganizing the government. Floyd, if you could address the fracking issue as you see it for natural gas supplies, and Bob, if you could address the future of OPEC in maybe 2 sentences, and then we'll have Amy and Winnie come on up. So go ahead.
Look, I've played the game of musical chairs in government, and one of the things we found is after 9/11, there are 26 different agencies that had something to do with national security. So we thought, well, let's make them into one. That sounds more efficient, and we don't have this. Well, we did, and now we have one of the hugest bureaucracies that you can't get involved and change out there. So I think the only problem is if you start to do the Department of Energy, which I think is a sound policy-making tool, usually, and Department of Interior takes care of our forests and our precious resources, and then you have the EPA who looks at air pollution and other things. You start putting those together, you don't know who ends up on top. And you may have one large EPA, which you don't want to have, or you might want to have one large Department of Energy, which you don't necessarily want to have. And every time you change administration, you really change the focus of what these agencies do. I think that's wrong-minded.
Thank you. Floyd?
Allow me to use one of my sentences to comment on that answer and one of my sentences on fracking. The one thing that this sentence, or this question really misses is what's critically important in electricity generation. That's called state PUCs. They actually control this. The federal government is not in the kind of control that you might think. Secondly, okay, on fracking, it works. And environmentally, it looks pretty safe. And it certainly is helping the production of natural gas. I think it's a great thing.
Bob, go ahead.
So on OPEC, I said earlier that I think that they're a force to be reckoned with because, you know what, they're not constrained by the Sherman Antitrust Act or other kinds of American laws that basically prohibit the combinations and restraint of trade. That's what they are designed to do, is to restrain trade. And to be a major player in a world market. And so what they do is they can affect the price in a world market by just affecting their production levels. And that's an act of the will for them. So we increase our production, they decrease theirs, the price stays the same.
I'd like to make one quick comment on that.
All right, one quick
Look, if we extend what our production facilities do what we can do in this country, we don't have to worry about OPEC.
Well, except this, Denny, that because I believe in free markets, that gasoline will not be sold here. It's sold to the highest bidder in a world market unless you want to do a protectionist regime that says, no, you can only sell that American oil in America, which is not the way we currently operate in this country. We Republicans have typically believed in free markets and that you can sell that gasoline wherever you want to sell it in this great big world at the highest available price. And so to ask our producers to sell it at a below market price within the United States seems to me quite contrary to what conservatives believe. So it's. I
think that was my point.
Well,
I think that was my point, my friend.
Well, so what's going to happen, though, is that oil is going to be sold wherever the highest bidder bids it up to, right? And so in the increasing demand in China and India, they're going to bid up that price. Well, so that American oil will not be burned in America necessarily. It will be burned wherever the highest bidder is. And so Saudi Arabians, who sit on enormous reserves, just turn back the spigot and wait until we're used up. And then they open up their spigot.
There's no evidence of them doing that.
No, it's exactly that evidence, Floyd. It's in the paper recently. In fact, AP had a story on this, but the headline is misleading. You get to the bottom of the article, and it talks about the production cutbacks in OPEC because of the increase in America. This is something that really I found, this is one of the reasons I got tossed out of Congress, is basically this kind of truth-telling to people who didn't want to hear this, that we don't like to hear this, that we don't have enough oil to affect the world price the way that OPEC does. We don't like to hear that, but if we can hear it, then we can play to our strength, which is being the innovators who say, why don't we innovate around that stuff? And say to the Saudis, you know, just like salt used to be a strategic commodity, and wars were fought over whether you had salt, because salt was necessary to preserve food.
I think we need to, Bob, I think we need to call time here and bring in some ladies. So, Amy, come on up.
I'm sure many of you have questions for our panelists, as Dr. Fung and I do as well. You have those cards that were given to you when you entered. If you have written questions during this time, if you would please submit them now. We're going to have ushers come down the middle aisle, I believe. So if you could pass them to the middle aisles if you have questions, and we will try to get to some of those before our time concludes. So I should just say before I start, I'm not going to ask a lot of questions, but it's fun for me to hear this discussion of energy because I hail from Midland, Texas, which some of you may have heard of, which is the center of domestic oil production at least in the lower 48. So we think about this a lot in my hometown. I wanted to sort of bring us back, however. We've had, I think, a really interesting discussion, lots of good conversation about the questions so far, but I thought it would be useful to circle us back to the topic, the title of today's panel, Responsible Stewardship of God's Resources, and try to look a little bit at that. I see this, of course, as rooted in the doctrine of creation, this idea that we are faithful stewards, that we need to be faithful stewards of all that God has created, and that we need to think of energy, as with other resources, as something given us to God, and that we need to be faithful stewards. So as I'm thinking about that, a couple things that come to my mind. One is stewardship for future generations. We're talking about many, not all, but most of the energy sources we're talking about are non-renewable. So we're talking about, we've had some debate over that, but we're depleting resources. So as we're thinking about that, I think our energy policy has to take both short-term concerns, but also has to be thinking long-term, how we're going to preserve things for future generations. I also think we have to consider the environment and environmental stewardship that has to be weighed in too. Costs, of course, are not purely financial. We have to consider those risks, obviously, carefully. They obviously have to be measured, but that, I think, also needs to play into stewardship. And then finally, has been touched on as well a little bit this evening, this concern for both domestic and international security. So much of U.S. foreign policy is caught up in this issue of energy. So much of even our domestic security is caught up in this as well. As the speaker noted, most of the members of OPEC are not exactly our best friends. There are lots of things here. With such great dependence on energy, many times these issues also spill over into domestic and international security. So all of these are just examples of how something that is really complex, like energy policy, becomes even more complex when we start thinking about all of the different ways that it affects our lives and the lives of others in our time and in the future. So with those few thoughts, here comes the question. What are some fundamental principles that you would suggest that we should keep in mind to encourage responsible stewardship of God's resources? And again, just ideas here as we're trying to think about this in this term of stewardship and what does it mean to be faithful with so much that God has given us. What might be some principles that we should keep in mind, either personally or, I can't help but ask this because I am the political science professor, as we think about public policy. So what are some principles that each of you think would be useful for this idea of responsible stewardship?
Want me to go first again? I think maybe the number one thing is efficient use. That's been the low-hanging fruit. The United States' use of energy has stayed flat now for almost a dozen years, and it's all because of efficiency. And if you take a look at how much energy do we get out of each gallon of fuel or kilowatt of electricity, et cetera, it's been amazing. And it's the old story. Whatever you use to the best of your ability to get maximum out. Now, total energy efficiency if you take a look at that whole 100 quads, rough numbers, of energy usage in the country, we're still only 42% efficient. And so we have a ways to go on that. And I would say using it efficiently is an important first step.
I'd agree completely. I think that is a place to start with efficiency. And then the thing I would add is we want to expand energy. The speaker said earlier, we could turn off the air conditioning, but I know that most of us don't want to do that, and I'm sure that he doesn't want to do that. What we really want to do is expand energy. We want more, not less energy, especially in the developing world. Because if you think about it, if we could move as quickly as possible to a distributed energy system where you're not reliant on a grid, but you're actually off-grid in various ways, and then take that to the developing world, all kinds of places could be running their computers and being productive in ways that we haven't seen the capacity of human beings to be productive in some parts of the world because just a lack of energy. So the wonderful opportunity here is, yes, start with efficiency, because that's where we can really get the low-hanging fruit, and then expand the energy system so we actually create more energy. And that involves surely drilling in the dirt, but I hope we drill in our heads as fast as we're drilling in the dirt so that we can find those new sources of energy, improve, for example, photovoltaics so that they're better, improve wind so it's even better, improve storage so that those make more reliable systems. If we do those sorts of things, we can be a blessing to the rest of the world and answer the stewardship to the humans within the system.
Well, it's interesting, this whole thing about energy, and we're using up all the world's resources. 150 years ago, we were burning whale oil. Now, there was a limited amount of whales, and today we would not think of doing that. Before that, we did wood, and they came up and they chopped down a lot of the forests. We don't do that anymore. But there are new technologies, and there are science. One of the things, enterprises I've gotten involved in since I've left Congress is LED lighting. LED lighting, for instance, these lights use X amount of electricity. An LED light in their place would use probably about 80% less electricity. A 40-watt bulb or 60-watt bulb would use 95% less electricity. It's new technology. 20% of our electric load goes to lighting, and if you can cut that amount down that you use, if you change your technology to about 60% or 70% of that load, there are a lot of new nuclear plants or gas-fired plants or oil plants that you don't have to build. So I think Floyd's point is that, look, we have to have technology. We need to develop, and this country and the world has done a very good job of developing new ideas. Who knows what our energy source is going to be 15 or 20 or 30 or 50 years from now? Who knows? But I think some of these interim things. But one of the things that is so important, that if we don't have a vibrant economy, then you don't have the dollars, the amount to put into research. You don't do the things. You'll be sitting and watch the rest of the world go by, kind of like what Japan's doing today. And remember, 10 years ago, Japan was one of the leaders of the world. But because they limited their energy resources, they've limited what they can do as an economy and what they can do in research and the new ideas that they can bring forward. Bob talks about solar, and they talk about wind. That's great. I watched these wind things go up in my old district, but they went there because Florida Power and Light had to have a certain energy standard they met. So they built these windmills up. They don't build them in Florida. They build them up in Illinois. Why? Because they're close to a grid. So the grid that served the nuclear plants is where all the wind generation is. If the grid wasn't there, those windmills wouldn't be there. And the fact is, a dirty little secret about wind energy is you have put windmills out in the middle of Nebraska and Texas and other places that are thousands of miles away from the market. And the grid is much more expensive to build than the windmills are. So unless you can find a cheap way to build the grid or a different way to move electricity, you're not going to do it. Talk about the rest of the world. You talk about the rest of the world, that if you could bring energy into remote areas of Africa and South America where people don't have energy today, so kids could read books at night, so that you could, clean water. The greatest killer in the world today isn't cancer or anything else, it's dirty water. And there's new technologies, but we will drive those. But unless we have the economic capacity to do the research, to be a vibrant economy, and I hope a lot of our neighbors around the world will be able to do that too. We won't be doing this if we harness ourselves and we put manacles on ourselves. We won't be a vibrant economy.
And that's a great transition to turn over to my colleague, Dr. Winnie Fung. So we have a few economic questions for you.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I would just like to follow up on the point about the energy efficiency and expanding energy resources. I'm an economist, and I tend to think of the world in terms of equations. So for me, one side of the equation would be energy consumption, and the other side of the equation would be energy production. So I do think about the energy efficiency part as the part pertaining to energy consumption. So I'm very interested when Mr. Kvamme, you talked about how energy efficiency is a low-hanging fruit, which I definitely agree. So we can think of energy efficiency as simply reducing the fast waste of energy in homes, offices, factories, vehicles, etc. And it could mean so many different things. It could mean having lighter cars, greener buildings. It could mean shutting down our laptop when we leave the office, etc. But the question I have is, why don't we see the US actually capturing this low-hanging fruit? Why are we not doing enough in terms of improving energy efficiency? Is there any way the government can actually introduce incentives to actually help induce us to capitalize on this energy efficiency? Should government impose a carbon tax, a gasoline tax, or some way of managing this?
Let me go first.
Sure.
You got my juices running. First of all, if you were in this country in 1970, the average four-passenger sedan would be getting 8 to 10 miles a gallon. Today, the average car gets 30 to 34 miles a gallon, the ones that you're buying on the showroom floor. That's energy efficiency. Today, or 60 years ago or 40 years ago, these lights would burn 120 watts. Today, you can have the same lights with 12 watts. That's energy efficiency. So we are moving to that. But you have to have the research. You have to have the ability to do that. If you start putting in an energy tax, a carbon tax, on things, carbon tax is the most regressive tax there is in the world, because you can put it at 3 points, either at the point of where you extract the energy from the ground or the generators, if it's electricity, or hydro or oil, you extract it from the ground, natural gas, you can tax it there, so you're taxing the big companies, or you can go and tax the generators, the people where you're using to you burn the fuel, or so you can go midstream, or you can go down to the consumer. But any way that you do it, the penalty falls on the consumer. The consumer is paying more and more, and the poor person who has to buy groceries, who has to buy heat, has to buy air conditioning, depending where you live, and has to buy fuel for their automobiles if they live in the country, or if they're producing, or if they're farmers, they're paying the most of the energy tax. So it's a regressive tax, which is the wrong type of tax, I think, to put on our citizens. Interesting enough, and I'm saying they pointed the difference out between cap and trade and energy tax, but when they started to put a regime of taxation in Germany, the consumers paid 30% more for their energy than they did before the tax, 30%. And I'll tell you what, I don't trust Congress, and I was there, or any other legislative body to say, well, look, we're going to tax your energy and we'll take it away from your income tax. Don't be fooled about that.
So yeah, that gets to the heart issue, right? Do we believe that we can trust our government to do that. And some people right now are saying no. But if we can't trust self-government, we've really got quite a challenge on our hands.
To do what?
To couple that carbon tax with, for example, a reduction in payroll tax. If you do that, you eliminate that regressive feature, because the payroll tax is the most regressive tax in our economy that you can't escape except by just not working. But a carbon tax, you could escape by switching off the air conditioning. You can actually reduce, you can decide how much you want to pay in tax. And the great question, the reason we don't have this innovation, to whom much is given, much will be required. We are very blessed, and we are these amazing innovators. Why aren't we innovating? Because it doesn't make economic sense to innovate. In South Carolina right now, I do not have a solar hot water heater on my roof. Why? Electricity is so cheap, or appears at the meter so cheap, that it doesn't make sense for me to have a solar hot water heater. Now, this is not new technology. If you go to the same latitude, Israel, Jordan, you'll see all kinds of solar hot water heaters on the roofs. None in South Carolina. Why? Because electricity is apparently cheap, but it's not cheap. 23,600 people die prematurely each year in the United States because of lung ailments caused by the soot from coal-fired electricity. 3 million lost work days. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. You can either pay at the meter for the true cost of that electricity, or we can hide it from you in higher insurance premiums, higher Medicare taxes, higher general taxes for Medicaid, and cost shift at your local hospital. Or you can pay at the meter and then have the liberty of enlightened self-interest cause Inglis, not by any government mandate or anybody with a bureaucracy telling me what to do, to pick up the phone and call a solar hot water heater installer and say, get quickly to my house, cut my electricity by 1/3. And then we innovate. And then if hot water heaters don't work in Illinois because it's colder here, well, you'll do something else. If you're in Oklahoma, you might have a wind turbine that provides you with some of your power. It depends on where you are, but that's why you can't have a central government planning it. But you just send an elegant price signal, and the result is that consumers take action. And capitalists, bless them, meet my needs and make money at it and create the wealth that creates the innovation. So we got a solution here. It's just fixing the economics.
When we started the energy report that we did in 2005, the projection for use of energy in the United States was that by 2030, we would be using 150 quads. Energy had historically risen about 3 to 3.5% per annum. And so that 100 quad level of 2005 was going to go up to 150 by 2030 over a 25-year span. As I mentioned earlier, last year, our energy uses was 97 quads, actually down from the 100 used in 2005. That's the level of energy efficiency that has actually been realized, and it's all over the place. The much better efficiency use of the energy that we have, specifically, well, actually both in the electricity sector and in the transportation sector. So there's a lot of evidence of that, and candidly, and I'm pretty proud of this, a lot of it is due to electronic controls being far more efficient. Let me just give you one example. It used to be true by a study done in 2002 or 3, I'm not sure which one, by Lawrence Livermore Lab, that your house used 8% of the electricity was being used by things you thought were off. Your television set, the charger that you de-hooked your phone from, the charger in your tool crib that wasn't being used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, across your house. 8% of your electricity was being used for that. Today, that number is under 1% because of modern, remember how those big, we used to call them wall warts, plugged into the wall, that great big thing, and remember it was warm? That's called energy waste. Today, it's a little tiny thing that goes into that box. That's just one example, and there are many.
Thank you very much. I have one more question I'm burning to ask, but I think I'll need to. Oh, okay. So we talked about expanding energy production, and I think Mr. Inglis also talked about we do want to innovate away from petroleum and try out other renewable energy sources. But at the same time, you also mentioned that it doesn't really make economic sense to innovate. I understand we are all for free market solutions, but in terms of exploring alternative energy sources, it does seem that some sort of government support or government subsidy will need to be in place in order to actually encourage private businesses to be willing to put in the large sunk cost of R&D to explore these energy resources. So just want to see what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the example I used of that Walmart thing had $0 from the federal government. It was just a good idea. And it turned out economically it worked. It turns out, since most of this stuff was built in China, just the physical weight of shipping that charger or that telephone or whatever it was with that heavier transformer-based thing, it was by using the new technology, you actually saved even in transportation costs, if you can believe that. So the economics played an enormous role, and I would say that when we go back to the issue of the states, I mentioned state PUCs. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a chart of the average cost of electricity by state. It's pretty clear to see where all the manufacturing in this country is done. Because in California, we have one of the highest costs of electricity. An advanced manufacturing plant is all about electricity costs. Your electricity costs are way over your total direct labor costs, and we don't have any factories in California as a result of that. We used to build all of our semiconductors in California. We don't build any there today. And it's 15, 16 cents a kilowatt hour that's killing us. Whereas in the lower cost states, they get manufacturing jobs as a result of those costs. Bob may not like that, but it's a fact of life. Why does Google put their data center in North Carolina, South Carolina? It's because their electricity costs are so low, and a data center is an enormous user of electricity. So it has a major economic impact on companies, the cost of electricity. And by the way, those of you that are thinking that people go to China today for labor rate are wrong. Dell's largest computer factory in China is lights out. There are no folks in the factory. It's tax costs, but it's also energy costs. The energy costs that they offer to American manufacturers are very low. We've got to get this right. And if we don't have competitive energy costs, we will not have a manufacturing sector.
Yeah, it's exciting to have Google in South Carolina and North Carolina. What's interesting is there's a California company that's making hydrogen fuel cells. It's called Bloom Energy, and they're the things that power those Google facilities. Reason Google is a very special customer. It cannot go down. And so they buy from Bloom Energy, Bloom boxes. It's a hydrogen fuel cell, and it powers the Google centers.
Oxide fuel cell, I'm an investor.
Yeah, so it's a fabulous thing. And so here we have somebody making a product available to us that's just meeting a great need with a special customer that cannot have a power outage. I do see a role for the government, but I see a different role maybe than you're seeing. The role I see for the government is just being the cop on the beat that says, we are going to hold you accountable for all of your costs, all in. Compete fairly. In other words, don't keep dumping your stuff on your neighbor's property. Biblical law prevents me from dumping my stuff on your property. That's English common law. It became American common law. It's a law of nuisance today. We allow that to happen with coal-fired electricity. We let them put the soot in the air, and 23,600 of us die prematurely each year in the United States because of it. And we lose 3 million lost workdays. Even if you think climate change is hooey, those health costs are real and quantifiable. And if you want to dispute that it's not 23,600, it's really less than that, it's more than zero.
But it's not from the carbon dioxide, it's from other things.
It's from the soot from the coal-fired electricity plants, right?
Which clean coal plants solve.
right? If clean coal can work, it will work because it's economic. And the way to make it economic is to make it valuable. And that's why, for example, the world's largest coal producer, BHP Billiton in Australia, is for a carbon tax. Reason? They think that their main customer, which is China, is going to innovate around them within a couple of decades because they're going to get tired of breathing that nasty air. And so BHP, which has 300 years of coal in the ground in Australia, realizes that they may have 2 decades left to live. So they say, get up the technology curve. Go ahead and tax carbon so that we can make it economic, because Floyd is exactly right. The public service commissions are the ones that make it possible for this to happen. They, in South Carolina right now, would not allow, for example, you to burn, do clean coal or an IGCC machine. Why? It'd be more expensive power as it appears at the meter. Because their charge is not to consider the whole cost of the healthcare system, but just the power cost. And so they wouldn't permit an IGCC machine, which would allow coal to be burned without any emissions at all, except water vapor, if the geology suits sequestration. That's a big if, but if it works, those machines are available today. They're not bought because it doesn't make economic sense to buy them, because you're not held accountable for your emissions. If you were held accountable for your emissions, then that innovation would happen. So I believe there is a role for the government. It's not in Solyndra kind of actions, because we see what happens there. The government isn't all-knowing and all-wise and can't pick winners and losers very well. The well-connected end up getting winners, being the winners. What's better is to just send an elegant price signal and then let the free enterprise system sort it out. But there's a role for the government in saying you're gonna be accountable for all of your costs, and we're not gonna let you get away with them. That seems to me is the role of government.
You know, it's interesting. I've been, my post-career, I've been involved with more lawyers than I want to ever admit. But I found one of the great words that lawyers use is elegant. And they use it time and time again, meaning there's something that everybody can't quite understand. So it's pretty fancy and it's got a lot of fringes on it, but watch out, because something elegant's going to come back and bite you someplace. And so I look at this thing, look at folks, you know, Bob was right. We don't want the government picking and choosing who the winners are in this country, because that's what we get. We get the Solyndras of the world. And we've just gone through an administration that likes to pick and choose. Matter of fact, they would like to do away with the Department of Energy and make the Department of EPA, you know, decide all the energy decisions in this country. My bottom line, and I know we're going to have more questions, is we need to use common sense regulation. We also need to unfetter our capital so that we can invest and have a growth economy, because that's when you get the investment in R&D. That's when somebody can find the most efficient light bulb or the most efficient way to burn coal. And, you know, this talk about, well, we weren't going to let it, look at, I was there when we put the SOx and NOx control on coal. What the goal of this country should be is to find a very efficient way to use the most abundant natural resource that we have. And, you know, what the Australians worry about the Chinese, they shouldn't be worrying, because, you know, in 5 years they're going to be buying all their natural gas. So, you know, they're still a supplier. But, you know, we need to come back and unfetter the market. Let the market drive. There needs to be common sense regulation. But government shouldn't be in a sense where they're either setting tax regimes, which causes social engineering in this country, or you shouldn't be putting regulation on that fetters the ability to invest capital and create jobs and do the research that this country needs to do to stay ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a ton of good questions here, but we're not going to do a ton of good questions. So I'll ask one question of each of our participants. I feel a little bit like Job negotiating about the future of Sodom here. I have a question that that deals with, can you name 3 elected officials in Washington whom you have the most regard on energy issues? I think what I'll ask you, Mr. Speaker, can you name 1 elected official in Washington that you have a high regard for on energy issues?
Yeah, I think Fred Upton from Michigan, southeast Michigan, almost our neighbor, Cubs fan, so he's close. You know, he sits there. He's an honest broker. He really tries to find good solutions, and he's an expert. I think there's very good people on staff, and the staff really drives those issues.
Can you say his name again?
Fred Upton.
Good enough. I have one for you, Floyd. Can you think of a successful green energy product from an investment point of view that's borne fruit in recent years?
There's lots of them. The example I used to reduce the energy consumption for turned off appliances, like your television set. Your television set used to consume a lot of power because it was waiting for you to go around and push the button. That is now well under a watt standard. As a matter of fact, it's down to about 30 milliwatts, which rounds to 0. So that's certainly one example.
Was that a new company or was that an established
The company
company?
started, I think, in the late 90s, but they brought that product to market in probably 2004 or 5, something like that. But that's one example. But there, in the lighting area that the speaker has talked about, there's been a lot of companies that, you know, gallium nitride was not a very common material. It's the glowing part of what's the laser that's the right frequency for LED lamps, and that's coming on. Companies like Cree, and a Carolina company, and other companies in the United States are perfecting that, and we're getting more and more and more efficient lighting as a result of that. Just the whole use of microelectronics to make, you know, like the efficiency standards in cars would not happen were it not for microelectronics. That's the big driver there. You know, essentially your car today is being tuned between every firing of a spark plug. That's pretty often, and that's done electronically. So there's a lot of products that are on the market. Because energy became an interesting investment area in about 2002. And entrepreneurs got interested. You know, we used to claim that we invested in 2 things: bugs and drugs, that was our biotech stuff; bits and bytes, that was our the information technology stuff. Bits and bytes, bugs and drugs. But now energy is a 3rd leg of a stool in the investment community, and it's a very, very active one. And a lot of people are doing very, very interesting things in the energy sector.
Okay, we had a couple questions, in fact, a bunch of questions about the future of nuclear. So Bob, why don't you start us, and then Floyd and Dennis, why don't you end it on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think nuclear is a particularly good way to make electricity, particularly as we're dependent on a grid or counting on a grid kind of system. That's one of the reasons, of course, that we in South Carolina are attracting a lot of industry, as was referenced earlier. About 50% of our power comes from nuclear. It's got no emissions. Now, there are trade-offs in a fallen world, and there is a trade-off here, and you got the problem of waste. But it's otherwise a very efficient way to make electricity, but I hope that in the future, as we get better and better technology, there may be better ways to make nuclear power plants, perhaps even smaller, not larger. Small nuke area, I think, is a very exciting thing. We used them and continue to use them very successfully in very confined spaces, as in submarines. So surely we could use them in cities. There's some exciting things that can be done there. And it's, by the way, it used to be that we conservatives were able to say it's just the enviros that keep us from building those nuclear power plants. That's really not the case. George Bush, with the help of Speaker Hastert and others, fixed that problem. Used to be you had to get 2 permits, 1 to construct, 2nd to operate. You get sued in the middle, and so no investor would lend you money to build the nuclear power plant because they weren't sure when it was going to start cash flowing. So George Bush said 1 permit, sure, you get sued on the front end, but once you finish all those lawsuits, you can build it. Some are going forward now, but not many. if you did what I was talking about earlier about a true cost comparison and attached to all the costs, nuclear would actually be very attractive, more attractive. Its relative merit would improve compared to some of the other fuels that emit carbon dioxide. And the result would be we'd actually build more nuclear power plants. So it's no longer the enviros that are really stopping us from nuclear. They do in some of those lawsuits. But it's really the economics that stop us from building nuclear power plants. Because it looks more expensive compared to, for example, the belching and burning of coal. Because you can belch and burn for free without any accountability for it. But if you make them accountable, then nuclear becomes relatively more attractive. You start building nuclear power plants.
Go ahead, Speaker.
It's interesting. There's a conundrum here. A conundrum in politics is a point here and a point there with a lot of bull in between. But what happens in nuclear power, you can talk about nuclear power. I wrote the Public Utility Act in Illinois in 1984. We had 14 nuclear power plants, 7 online, 7 coming online, and Commonwealth Edison owned most of them. Union Electric had a couple. But the issue there was, excess capacity. Well, today, the problem isn't excess capacity. The problem is that this administration has really shut down Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain is a place that you store waste energy. We have around the 100 and some plants in the United States today, dry cask storage in almost every one of those plants. It means on that facility, you have X amount of land to put dry cask storage. When the plant is filled up with dry cask storage and you don't have any place to put it, you shut down the plant. So it's been the environmentalist, quote unquote, way of basically shutting down nuclear energy by limiting the lack of storage. Now, maybe we could send it to South Carolina, the Savannah River, and reprocess, but I'll tell you, that's a long way off, and that's probably not going to happen in our lifetime. I'm pretty old. But anyway, the whole issue of nuclear energy is, when I wrote the Public Utility Act in 1984, I predicted that we won't see another nuclear power plant built in this country in 25 years, and I was right. It hadn't been. Why? Because there's too many encumbrances put in the way to be able to do it. I had a discussion with a guy named John Rowe, happened to be the president of Commonwealth Edison, and largest nuclear power operator in the country. And he said, I will never build another nuclear plant in this country. Why? Because who is willing to put down $14 or $15 billion and hope that 10 years after you get it built, you'll get it, somebody will give you a permit to run it. And if it won't be a NIMBY or some kind of group that wants to shut it down, it's too unpredictable. He said, I will never build one. This is a year ago. So I don't see we're going to see a lot of money. Maybe Duke down in North Carolina or South Carolina will build one of those things, but I doubt that'll ever get built. But that's my point of view. We have to go to other ways, and I think we will. After Fukushima, I think the public trust, whether you can do it or you can't do it, it's what the public perception is. And I don't think there's too much public perception in this country or in other places that are going to allow, or maybe down the way, and maybe the Japanese will turn their plants back on and get public trust back in place. But I don't think the public trust is there for nuclear energy. So I don't think that's the solution to the future. Even as cheap as it is and as clean as it is, and I always thought it was the answer. It was the environmental answer to clean energy. But I don't think it's going to happen.
Floyd, you're our last thought here.
Okay. Well, it's a wonderful way to finish because I actually agreed with what Bob said on nuclear. Seriously, as the speaker has just said, we have 104 different nuclear power plants in this country today operating. They are all first-generation plants. The ones going in South Carolina and the Georgia border right now, there's 4, 2 dual plants, are Gen 3 plants. And the safety features of a Gen 3 plant are dramatically different than those of a Gen 1 plant. You could also say that the 104 that are installed and operating, they were all engineering jobs. They were all different. And today, there are basically 2 different reactors that people choose from. And thus, you do have about 22 different applications before the NRC to build nuclear plants in this country. Fukushima did not help matters, there's no question, because of the public perception of nuclear. But with a Gen 3 plant, they all look the same. Today, for example, in France, most of the plants, they have some Gen 1s as well, look the same. And that makes a huge difference. And as the speaker has indicated, the operating and maintenance costs, the O&M costs for nuclear are very, very low. In California, less than 1 cent a kilowatt for the nuclear plants we have going. You know, in energy, they talk about two things when you build a plant. They use the term overnight cost, if you're familiar with that. Namely, what does it take to turn the first watt out, and then what does it cost to run the thing per kilowatt hour? Nuclear is a nice feature that, yes, it has high initial overnight costs, but the O&M is actually quite attractive. So I think there's some hope. I'm more hopeful than the speaker is on what happens with nuclear because of the safety perception. Now again, if people keep thinking Gen 1, I mean, how would you like to have everything you run today from a technology purpose based on 1975 technology? You wouldn't like that. Today, we do live in 2012, and Gen 3 is the way to go, and Gen 4 is coming, and we have to keep that in mind. So I'm hopeful that there might be there, but it's one heck of a tough thing. And maybe, from a manufacturing sector point of view, the fact that the Chinese are turning out a lot of Gen 3 plants, maybe that will convince people to say, hey, maybe they're right, and maybe we're a little behind, and maybe we ought to catch up.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Ladies, thank you very much.